one of the things that you mentioned there, Akala, is education as an inoculation. And so there, I would like for you to just explain what you mean. You've contextualized it quite well, but if
Yeah.
you could give a bit of an example of the whole idea that we have to be inoculated from something. I just want that to be clearly articulated because we're in a moment here where we're battling with what we memorialize. We have a whole host of contentious discussions about which statues to take down and which history is being indoctrinated, etc. And your premise there is that there's a certain kind of education that requires us to be inoculated from something.
Yeah.
From what? And what does inoculation mean?
So in the British context, in every society, right, nations have ways they remember themselves, and the ways that they remember themselves are usually very flattering to the people in power. Yeah, and they neglect the ways in which people with less power have shaped the nation. So, for example, in Britain, I was taught in school, as every British child is taught, Britain was the first country in the world to abolish slavery. It did so primarily for moral reasons, and it was primarily because of a man called William Wilberforce, who was an elite parliamentarian in Britain.
Can you repeat his name? Just say
William Wilberforce.
Got it. Mm-hmm.
What we call the Wilberforce myth in England. Now, it is true there was a larger abolitionist movement in Britain than any other European slaveholding power. It is true that some members of British Parliament fought for the abolition of the slave trade. It isn't true that Britain was the first country in the world to abolish slavery. Revolutionary France abolished slavery before Britain, as did Denmark abolish its slave trade. But the first major slaveholding power to actually abolish slavery was Haiti. And it did so at the cost of 100,000 African lives. And it did so in opposition to the British Empire, who tried to crush the Haitian Revolution, and in opposition to the French Empire. And the British even helped the French attempt to reconquer Haiti and reinstall slavery after they had failed. So clearly it wasn't entirely moral, and it wasn't out of a love for Africans that the British government abolished slavery. British slave masters were paid compensation. The bonds that compensation was paid back through, British taxpayers didn't finish paying off those bonds until 2015. Yeah, so when we talk about reparations, British Caribbean taxpayers paid reparations to British slave masters, essentially, or paid off part of that debt via the government bonds until 2015. If you're a young black kid growing up in Britain and you believe the entire sum total of black people's contribution to the human story is being enslaved and then getting set free by a benevolent British parliamentarian, and then maybe, Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, no disrespect to the greatness of Dr. King, but he would reject the idea that he was the sum total of black people's historical contribution out of hand. So if you're a black kid growing up with that, and furthermore, if you're a non-black person growing up with the belief that that is black people's sum total of contribution, how can you believe there's any worth in black human beings? When we think of India, we immediately think, even if we're not directly aware of Indian history, of thousands of years of written history, of the history of Hinduism and Sikhism and civilizations that existed in India. And that filters down into the stereotype of Indian computer scientists today and doctors and lawyers. And so in a British context, we are now at kind of peak absurdity where, again, British West African kids are doing comparatively well in school. And still there is this general narrative that black kids, undifferentiated by class, undifferentiated by parental background, undifferentiated by whether or not their children are, whether their parents are West African university educated civil servants or British Jamaican bricklayers, as my dad is, just black kids are trouble. Even in a country where the majority of the poor people are white, even in a country where the vast majority of the murders are white on white, even in a country where the majority of the prison population is white. So even demographically, we're not in even vaguely the same situation as the US, because there just aren't enough black people. Obviously, black people in the US are still a minority, but they're a much bigger minority than black people in Britain. And so I was inoculated against a lot of that, what can only be described as anti-African propaganda, a lot of the sort of Tarzan image of Africa. I was aware, and I still think, Africa's having a major blip in a way that you could call the last couple of centuries of African history maybe Africa's dark ages. And even in that, there have been civilizations and histories and a lot more victories and success stories than you traditionally believe. But I was always able to ground from a very young age slavery and colonialism in history that went all back to Shango Bolo or the Napa Playa, which is an astronomical observatory, or to ancient Egypt and Nubia. And so it historically grounded me in a way that I was certain I wasn't inferior, and what was being promoted on British television was basically nonsense. And so that was what I needed to be inoculated against. But I would actually argue that non-black people need to be inoculated against this nonsense too, because Ironically, now that Black Londoners are becoming really successful, there is a massive Black middle class growing, along with still problems with gangs and street stuff and all of that. But there's like what I would like to call the Americanization of Black London, where the Black folks who've made it are doing very, very well. That wasn't the case before. The Black folks who haven't made it, it's getting even worse, right? And so as this chasm opens up, lots of people find the success of Black London as a reason to be resentful, because they've internalized, again, this idea that Black people's station in life is at the bottom. And so seeing Black Londoners make it has led in the British press, right across the press from left to right, this propaganda that they call the left behind white working class. So the idea is that poor whites are being left behind, not because they're poor, not because of a classism that predates the Black presence in Britain by 1,000 years, or at least the Windrush Black presence in Britain by 1,000 years. But the evidence that poor whites are being left behind is not the chasm between poor whites and wealthy white people. It's the much smaller gap between poor whites and working class Black folk who are doing that little bit better in school now. But when you look at who working class Black folk in Britain are, particularly West Africans, we're essentially comparing the children of university educated West African civil servants who happen to have ended up in the hood because of discrimination, even though they've got degrees in engineering or accountancy or whatever it is from back in Ghana and Nigeria, to working class white English folks and working class Black English folks, which is a phrase we never use, because working class Black English folks, like my family's grandparents came from the Caribbean, they're doing just as badly in school as poor white kids. So there is no great mystery here. The children of university educated West Africans, shock horror, are doing a little bit better. And that is now being turned into racial resentment and race baiting by much of the British press, who believe that Black people's station in life is permanently at the bottom.